It's in a book, a reading rainbow.
All right, and with us today on the Reading Rainbow of Death, we have a very talented writer, Mr. Matthew M. Bartlett. He wrote Gateways to Abomination, which was self-published. I could be wrong, but I think his first book. Creeping Waves, his newest one, Stay Awake Men. It's hard to keep up with everything new with you because you have a lot of stuff coming out all the times. But I think those are the three big ones, and many anthologies, too many to name. And I think of Doomful Portent, which is some flash fiction with an artist who I won't even pretend I can say his name. I'll let you say it, is coming out soon. Matthew M. Bartlett. So Matthew, thank you for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Not a problem. Okay, now, you are actually the second independent horror writer I started reading. Doug Rinaldi was my first guest. He was the first one I ran into on the Bones page, and after reading some of his stuff and enjoying it, I said, hey, who else writes that I don't know about? Because I'm kind of in a place where it's hard to find people. And you were one of the first names he mentioned. I believe he said he saw you at a public reading somewhere and thought your stuff was amazing. So I picked up Gateways from Abomination, and it was fantastic. For anyone that hasn't read, you deal with a witch coven and kind of a radio station. There's a lot of shenaniganry and dark magic stuff going on. I always have trouble explaining how it all links together. So, a big vague question to kind of let you tell everyone what it is you do, how your books read much better than I could. Not just what got you into wanting to write horror, but you have a very kind of specific way you went into it. So what got you wanting to write horror, and especially what kind of inspired you to do what you do?
Well, I wrote a little bit when I was in college. It wasn't so much horror as I was in kind of a couple of poetry classes and was kind of interested in the Beat Generation writers like Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, a little darker. But I loved horror, but I never really thought I had the capacity to write it. And in about 2004, a friend of mine had a live journal that was fictional. Each day or every couple of days, he would do an installment of a story of this kind of wacky town, and it was very funny and entertaining, and I thought I would like to do a fiction live journal. And it would be short pieces. It would be kind of way to start writing without a lot of the commitment. I didn't have a huge audience. I had a couple friends who would read these things, and I thought, well, I love horror, so I will do a horror-themed fictional live journal. And I just dove in, and one day I just typed in this story that I was sitting at home, and I got in the car and started driving, and something strange came on the radio. I did that on my own personal live journal, and then I linked to the new live journal, which would be the fictional whatever. And those became Gateways to Abomination. And the way it started, again, was just short blasts of fiction. Like at the time, I was not thinking of a larger narrative, except, kind of in a very, very grand scale, a larger concept, but not necessarily a through line. That kind of came later. But maybe the style was affected by the fact that I would just kind of, some days I would do 3 stories, and then 2 weeks would go by and I would do nothing, and then I would do a story. Whenever it occurred to me, I would just hop online and do another thing. And they were kind of what I called in a conversation with somebody else, distilled horror. There was not a lot of boring parts, at least not a lot of parts that bored me to write. So, and that way, I kind of over the course of about 10 years, maybe 8 years, I worked on this website, and it became this just kind of thing that I did on the side. And then down the line, it occurred to me these could all be put together into a book. And oddly, the first time I self-published it, I did it on a website called Blurb. That it was a very expensive book. There was a lot of pictures in it. It was very visual, and it was something that even the writer had to buy a copy in order to have a copy. And it was like something like $38 for this oversized paperback. A lot of the stories that are in Gateways are in that, and it didn't get any notice because there was no real platform on which to advertise it. And I was not at all in any way plugged into anything like the horror community at that time. I didn't even know it existed. So whenever I put a link to it up on Facebook, it was to my 30 or 40 friends that I made in college and high school and working life.
Yeah. Now that's a question I've asked everybody else, and I suppose you might have just answered it pretty well. So it's self-publishing. I mean, Gateways was entirely self-published, and you decided the self-published route out of just not wanting to mess around with trying to get someone to pick it up, or I mean, it sounds like at the time you really didn't even, you were just writing without any thought to how you would publish anyways. So was it that you got tired of shopping it, or you didn't know to shop it, or it was too much a hassle and you're like, I'll just do it myself?
Well, here's the thing. I was in a live journal group, and I would post the stories to this group that was kind of like creepypasta type fiction or whatever, and people said, you should publish these, but the first thing you need to do is stop putting them online, because no publisher is going to touch something that's been put online. It's essentially already been quote unquote published. Yeah. So in essence, all of Gateways had already been inadvertently and accidentally self-published by way of the internet. So I really felt like I had no choice but to make a book myself. And I had seen instances of books, or rather of people's websites being turned into books, usually non-fictional things. I think there was a guy who had a blog about being a waiter, and that, a publisher jumped on that and said, turn it into a book. And I said, well, I'm just going to turn my website into a book on my own. And that coincided around with my going to Necronomicon in 2013, a writers' conference in Providence. I went as a fan and as a reader. I shouldn't say fan, more of a reader of horror and weird fiction. Again, at the time, not very much plugged into what was current and what was currently being written. Yeah. But I got the bug there to really move forward with the book, and it was a couple months later that I put it out, and I had begun to add friends on my Facebook who were in the horror community, and things just kind of escalated from there, I guess. But I felt like I didn't have a choice. It had technically already been self-published, so I didn't bother shopping it to anybody.
And one thing I've noticed that seems to at least hold true for you, I've heard a lot of, I didn't know anything about any kind of scenes, horror scenes, writer scenes. I was a musician, so I met Rab, and Rinaldi got me turned on to some authors. I met Rab, and talking to him and working with him has kind of showed me this whole world of everyone. But I've noticed a lot of people kind of have run into like a nose turned up at self-publishing kind of thing. You seem to be an exception. You seem to be the one that everyone's like, yes, self-publishing is terrible, you shouldn't do it. If you're good, someone will publish it. You seem to be the example for every Matthew Bartlett. I've actually heard that. For every Matthew Bartlett, there's 1,000 terrible writers. So, have you faced any of that, or is it how it seems and everybody was just like, okay, he's the exception?
Well, people didn't necessarily know it right off the bat. And I think a couple of factors contributed to that, including I had my cover was done by a professional graphic designer who was a friend of mine. So it looks different. It has a unique look, but to me, it doesn't look self-published.
Yeah.
And what the cliche of self-publishing would be, which would be, something badly photoshopped. And I desperately almost did something like that. I almost had a terrible cover. But my wife did the illustrations that are on the cover. She's not a professional artist, but I really love her artwork. She's done some painting just kind of to entertain herself, and in any event, and then the book was not. I think I want to tread carefully when I talk about self-publishing, because the cliche of self-publishing and people who self-publish is that they behave poorly on social media. Their books are not edited and are full of errors and just kind of a shoddy mess. That's the cliche. And in my case, I plead guilty to the fact that my book was not edited, and it was proofread by 3 different people. And it seems to be fine for not having been edited. It's not a novel, you know what I mean? And it's kind of its own thing. And I think maybe the uniqueness of it wasn't a traditional collection of 5,000, 6,000 word stories. It was these flash pieces that, if the reader is patient, begin to add up to something a little more, an overarching story or theme or narrative or whatever. And for whatever reason, people liked it, and it started to make the rounds, and that's why I think it gets called the exception, and the rule apparently is just really, really poorly done, sloppily put together, ugly little books. But I tend to I grew up. My brother was in punk rock bands, and these bands, they recorded their own music, they did their own cover art, they booked their own tours and shows, and it was kind of in that spirit in which I undertook making this book.
Yeah, and that's one thing I've said to other people. I know I've said it on the show, so I won't go in at length, but I was amazed at that kind of attitude, that people didn't do that, and kind of turned their noses at it. But I grew up a musician, so when I found out there was a stigma, I was like, what? That's weird. But yeah, and also one of the reasons I've done this show, and I tell people, because I imagine there is in self-publishing quite a bit of that, and maybe I got lucky running into Doug and Rab, but have found, I have a couple shelves full of stuff now, and I haven't come across anything that feels poorly written or badly put together. I'm probably just met some of the right people, and so I get to hear all the right names now. So that's the other reason I'm doing this. And
well, I think,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I try to steer people directly to your Facebook pages, because I was like, I imagine it is stormy water, but these guys all seem to be really cool and happy to talk to people and recommend good stuff. So I specifically don't just buy their book. If you want to read more and don't get stuck with the stinkers, friend them on Facebook and say, I have a couple books. I believe, I don't even know if you remember, but I was picking up Creeping Waves. It was before I even met Rab. I was picking up Creeping Waves off Amazon, and I had talked to you once, maybe just saying, hey, like your stuff. And out of nowhere, I messaged you and was like, I need to hit $25 for my free shipping on Amazon. I'm buying your book. The way I see it, you owe me a couple recommendations of what else to buy. And you very pleasantly told me a couple books, and they both turned out to be fantastic. So everyone listening, don't just buy their books. Find them, and they're very pleasant chaps who will recommend really great independent fiction.
I think there's a good number of people doing important. I didn't mean to use the word important. I just think there are people doing good work in self-publishing, and I think it's kind of a wave of independent writers, and they have different and novel approaches, and I think it's just healthy for the genre. For like Tom Breen, for example, who I've known for a very long time, and just a phenomenal fiction writer. And yeah, he kind of came up his own way doing his Orford Parish books, doing publishing of these sort of mini anthologies with 2 or 3 or 4 stories in them by the likes of Jonathan Rabb and Sean M. Thompson, myself, and it's exciting to be a part of it, I think, and it's also exciting to be among the crowd of current very, very talented horror and weird fiction writers that are writing right now. I think it's a really good time for fans of weird fiction.
Yeah, as a reader, this year has been amazing, because it's when I found out most of you. I've had a couple of your books for a while, but finding Rab kind of, I was like, when I met him, I was like, what else is good? And he just sent this big, long, scrolling message of names and publishers, and it's been a great year. Well, we're rolling towards the end. I know we really only touched on Gateways, so I am going to tell people Creeping Waves and Stay Awake Men, both excellent books. I don't think we even come close to have the time to run off all the anthologies that you're in. Recently, I know Terror in 16 Bits. Do you got a story in Test Patterns? I haven't got to that. I got it on myself, and I haven't got to it. And while you're on the air, Of Doomful Portent is coming out soon again, right?
Yes, it was a limited edition, kind of an advent calendar, put together by, and you're going to make me pronounce his name now, Yves Torini, I believe is the pronunciation. He's a Canadian game designer and artist, and he put together this kind of tearaway advent calendar with stories and illustrations. It was a limited edition, and tomorrow will be out in a traditional paperback format, and I'm excited about it. I think it's a very cool combination of flash fiction and illustrations that, like Gateways, although maybe a little looser, does have a kind of an overarching story. So that's a fun one, I think, and very, very dark and hopefully upsetting.
And anything else you want to plug that's going to be in something, or that you got going in the works before we go?
I would say you mentioned Test Patterns. Up and coming publishers put that book together. I think it's a good collection. I'm particularly proud of my story in Test Patterns. It's on the shorter side. It's called Call Me Corey. And to me, it's one of, I don't always enjoy reading my own stuff. This particular story I do like. And also I would say the magazine Strange Eons. Tom Breen and I collaborated on a story in that.
Yeah.
And that's one that a great horror and weird fiction magazine that also has, I think, some graphic fiction in it. It's absolutely worth picking up.
Yeah, that was. I had Tom on last month, and I had got my copy last month, which is a fantastic story. I don't have time to sit here and tell you all the fantastic stories you have, but that is one of them. So that is Matthew Bartlett, everyone.
Thank you.
As much as I wish we would have, we didn't really even touch into how odd his world is. If I can try to wrap it up really quick, it feels very New England. That might just be the witches. It feels very New England and at times quite abstract in an odd nightmare kind of way. Like, it's not always just graphic things happening. There's a whole lot of unsettlingness in it. And then the way you use the radio station to wrap them up into a narrative that's actually going somewhere. It's a bunch of stuff all done great, and that all works together well.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope it's more interesting than listen to me blather on. It's idiosyncratic, definitely, and kind of has a hallucinatory and very dark and strange aspect to it, or at least that's what was intended.
And that's exactly how it comes off. And Matthew, we appreciate you being on our little show, The Reading Rainbow of Death. And as always, I look forward to more work of yours coming out.
Thank you again for having me. It was a good time, and I wish we could talk longer another time.
Exactly. All right. Oh, and before I go, floating around on the Spooklights podcast, Matthew, me, and Tom Breen had just played a role-playing game with John Rabb hosting on his Spooklight podcast, where I got half drunk and nearly got everyone killed, and then did trip over myself fall and missed out the end of the game while they went and saved the day because of my mistakes. So if you want to watch or want to listen to that, go to find Spooklights podcast, and you can hear me, Matt, and Tom play a role-playing game in the Cthulhu kind of world. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
It's good to hear from you, Matt.
Good talking to you.
Yeah.
Way to go.